April 10, 1912, Southampton, England. The RMS Titanic stands ready to embark on its maiden voyage. Crowds line the docks, their cheers echoing as passengers board with dreams of new beginnings across the Atlantic. But in the shadow of this grand departure, something sinister stirs. A chill runs through the air, unnoticed by most, but felt by a few. This is the story of the ghostly warning, a tale of hauntings, premonitions, and mysteries that cling to the Titanic like mist over the sea. It's a story rooted in history, tied to the very moment the ship sets sail, and it will leave you questioning whether some tragedies are foretold long before they unfold. The Titanic was a marvel, a symbol of human triumph. Its grand staircase gleamed with polished oak, its dining room sparkled with crystal chandeliers, and its engines roared with the promise of speed. On April 10th, as the ship prepared to depart, the mood was electric. Wealthy tycoons, hopeful immigrants, and proud crew members stepped aboard, unaware of the fate awaiting them. But one woman, standing apart from the cheering crowd, felt a dread so heavy it seemed to anchor her to the dock. Her name was Eleanor Smith, wife of Captain Edward Smith, the Titanic's commander. What she experienced that day would haunt her for the rest of her life, and it's a mystery that remains unclosed to this day. Eleanor wasn't boarding the Titanic. As the wife of the White Star Line's most respected captain, she stayed behind in their modest Southampton home, waiting for Edward's return from what was meant to be a historic voyage. At 11 a.m., as the Titanic's horn signaled its departure, Eleanor sat in her drawing room, a cup of tea trembling in her hands. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Then, without warning, the door creaked open. Eleanor's heart skipped. Standing in the doorway was her husband, Edward, dressed in his crisp white Star Line uniform, his captain's hat tilted slightly. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow, like windows to an empty soul. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at her. He crossed the room, his boots making no sound on the hardwood floor, and stopped at the window, staring out at the distant harbor. Eleanor called his name, but before she could stand, he vanished like a shadow swallowed by light. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She checked the clock. 11:03 a.m., the exact moment the Titanic was pulling away from Southampton, headed for Cherbourg. Edward was supposed to be on the bridge, guiding the ship. There was no way he could be in her drawing room. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of her tired mind, but the cold dread in her chest wouldn't lift. Later that evening, she wrote in her diary, "I saw him, clear as day. It was Edward, but not Edward. His face was wrong, like death had already claimed him. I fear he will never come home." Those words, found years later by historians, sent chills through anyone who read them. How could Eleanor have seen her husband hundreds of miles away at the very moment the Titanic began its doomed journey? Eleanor's vision wasn't an isolated incident. Across Southampton, as the Titanic sailed away, other families of crew members reported strange occurrences. Mary Thompson, the wife of a stoker named John, woke that morning to find her husband's work boots by their bedside. The problem: John had taken those boots aboard the Titanic. Mary swore she heard his voice whisper, "I'm sorry, love," before the boots vanished. She ran to a neighbor's house, sobbing, convinced something terrible was coming. Another woman, Clara, the sister of a Titanic steward, claimed she saw her brother's face in a mirror that morning, his eyes wide with fear. When she turned, no one was there. These accounts, documented in local newspapers like the Southern Daily Echo, painted a picture of a town gripped by an eerie unease as the Titanic departed. What was happening? Why did so many people connected to the Titanic's crew experience these chilling visions on April 10th? Some historians point to the ship's construction in Belfast, Harland, and Wolf Shipyard, where whispers of a curse began long before the Titanic ever touched water. Workers reported tools disappearing, machinery failing without explanation, and strange noises echoing through the empty hull. One laborer, Patrick O'Malley, swore he saw a figure in a captain's hat standing on the unfinished bridge late at night. "He wasn't one of us," Patrick later told a Belfast reporter. "He just watched, silent, then was gone. I never went back to that ship." Superstitious workers whispered that the Titanic was built on greed and hubris, its massive size defying the sea itself. Could these early hauntings have been warnings of the tragedy to come? Captain Edward Smith himself seemed to sense something wrong. On the morning of April 10th, as he boarded the Titanic, a young deckhand overheard him mutter, "This ship feels heavy, like it's carrying more than passengers." The comment was odd for a man known for his calm, commanding presence. In Letters to Eleanor, written during the ship's trials, Edward hinted at unease. One letter, dated March 1912, read, "I feel eyes on me, Eleanor, eyes that aren't there. This ship is grand, but it carries a weight I cannot name." Historians have debated whether Smith's words were mere fatigue or something deeper, a premonition of the disaster that would claim his life and over 1,500 others. The strangest account of April 10th came not from Southampton, but from a small Scottish orphanage, hundreds of miles away. A 10-year-old girl named Jessie, frail and dying of tuberculosis, lay in a Salvation Army hospice. As the Titanic departed, Jessie suddenly sat up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. She grabbed the arm of a nurse and whispered, "I see a great ship, shining with lights. It's sinking in the dark, and people are screaming. A man named Wally is playing a fiddle." Trying to keep them calm, the nurses, thinking she was delirious, tried to soothe her, but Jessie insisted, "The man with the fiddle will drown, but his music will live." Hours later, she slipped into a coma and died. Days after the Titanic sank, historians realized Jessie's vision matched real events. Wally was Wallace Hartley, the Titanic's bandleader, who famously played "Nearer, My God, to Thee" as the ship went down. How could a dying child, far from the sea, have seen this tragedy unfold? Jessie's vision wasn't the only one. In London, a psychic named William Stead, who would later board the Titanic, wrote in his journal on April 9th, "I feel a shadow over this voyage. Last night, I dreamed of ice and screams." Stead, a spiritualist, was known for his eerie predictions, but even he didn't heed his own warning. He perished in the sinking. His journal later recovered by his family. In Ireland, a fisherman named Thomas claimed he saw a vision of a sinking ship while mending nets on April 10th. He described a giant steamer, broken into, with lights flickering in the dark. His account, published in a Dublin paper, was dismissed as madness until news of the Titanic's fate reached shore. These stories, scattered across Britain, share a chilling thread. They all happened on or around April 10, 1912. As the Titanic began its journey, paranormal researchers believed the ship's tragedy was so immense it cast a shadow backward in time, touching those with connections to the doomed wives, sisters, even strangers like Jessie. Some say the Titanic was cursed, its grandeur built on the exploitation of shipyard workers and the arrogance of its owners, who called it unsinkable. Others argue the visions were collective fear, a shared anxiety about a ship too big, too bold for the sea to forgive. But there's another layer to this mystery, one that deepens the unease. On April 10th, as the Titanic steamed towards Cherbourg, a first-class passenger, Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, reported a strange encounter. She was walking the promenade deck when she saw a man in a captain's uniform standing alone, staring at the horizon. Thinking it was Captain Smith, she approached to greet him, but he turned and walked through a closed door, vanishing. Margaret later told friends, "He looked like the captain, but his eyes were wrong. They were empty, like he'd already seen the end." Was this another vision of Edward Smith, or something else, a spectral warning of the iceberg waiting in the dark? The Titanic's departure wasn't just a moment of celebration. It was a moment when the veil between worlds seemed to thin. Crew families in Southampton continued to report odd occurrences in the days that followed. Baker's wife, Ellen, found her husband's pocket watch left aboard the ship ticking on her kitchen table on April 11th. When she picked it up, it stopped, never to work again. A cold tremor's daughter, Annie, woke to whispers of her father's voice saying, "Don't worry, pet." Though he was far out at sea, these stories, collected by local historians, suggest the Titanic carried more than passengers. It carried an energy, a presence, that reached back to those left behind. By April 14, 1912, the Titanic would strike an iceberg, and the world would learn the cost of its hubris. But the ghostly warnings of April 10th hinted something deeper, something unexplainable. Did the ship's fate ripple through time, touching those who loved its crew? Was there a curse born in the Belfast shipyards that marked the Titanic for doom? Or were these visions the product of fear, amplified by a tragedy too vast to comprehend? Eleanor Smith never spoke publicly of her vision, but her diary entries grew darker as news of the sinking reached her. She wrote, "I saw him again. In my dreams, standing on a broken ship, surrounded by ice. He looked at me, and his eyes said goodbye." To this day, the ghostly warning of April 10, 1912, remains unclosed. No one can explain why Eleanor saw her husband's ghost, why Jessie saw the Titanic's end, or why so many felt the weight of disaster before it struck, paranormal investigators still visit Southampton, seeking traces of the Titanic's restless spirits. Some claim to hear whispers near the old docks, voices calling names in the fog. The Titanic's wreck, lying 12,500 feet below the Atlantic, holds secrets we may never uncover. But one thing is certain, on that bright April morning, as the world celebrated a new era, something ancient and unseen was already mourning its end. April 14, 1912. 11:40 p.m. The RMS Titanic slices through the icy North Atlantic, its grand silhouette a beacon of human ambition. Above, in the glittering first-class ballrooms, passengers dance under chandeliers, their laughter drowning out the hum of the engines. But below, in the dim, cramped corridors of third class, a nightmare is brewing. This is the locked gates, a true story of terror, desperation, and unanswered questions that cling to the Titanic's tragedy like frost on a frozen sea. When the ship struck an iceberg, hundreds of passengers found themselves trapped behind iron bars, their screams swallowed by rising water. Tonight, we dive into a chilling tale tied to that doomed night, one that will grip your soul and leave you wondering, was it chaos, cruelty, or something far darker that sealed their fate? The Titanic was a floating city, but it was a city divided. First-class passengers sipped champagne in opulent dining rooms, their cabins draped in silk and mahogany. Second-class travelers read in cozy libraries or strolled the promenade. But third-class passengers, mostly immigrants chasing the American dream, lived in a different reality. Their quarters were buried deep below the waterline, where the air was thick with coal dust and the rumble of engines shook the walls. Families shared tiny cabins, bunk beds creaking under the weight of hope. On April 14, 1912, as the Titanic steamed toward New York at full speed, these passengers slept, unaware that an iceberg was about to tear through their world. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck the iceberg. For those in the upper decks, it was a gentle jolt, barely enough to spill a glass of wine. First-class passengers paused their card games, chuckling at the thought of a minor mishap. But deep in the boiler rooms and third-class compartments, the truth hit like a hammer. The iceberg's jagged edge ripped through the ship's hull, sending freezing water pouring in. Crew members, trained to maintain order, scrambled to their stations. Lifeboats were uncovered, their canvas covers flapping in the night wind. But for the hundreds of third-class passengers, the disaster began not with a call to the lifeboats, but with a sound that still haunts history, the heavy clang of iron gates slamming shut. Margaret Murphy, a 24-year-old Irish woman traveling with her sister Kate, survived the sinking and later wrote a letter that chilled readers across Ireland. Published in the Cork Examiner in May 1912, her words painted a vivid picture of terror. We were asleep when the ship shook, the lights flickered, and we heard men shouting to run. We grabbed what we could and followed the crowd, but the gates were locked. Sailors stood there, their faces like stone, holding rifles. We begged, we screamed, but they wouldn't open the gates. The water was so cold, like needles in my legs, and it kept rising. I saw mothers lift their children above it, crying for mercy that didn't come. Margaret's escape was a miracle. A young crew member, his eyes wet with tears, unlocked a gate at the last moment, letting her and Kate slip through to the upper decks. Most weren't so lucky. Why were the gates locked? The official report, presented at the U.S. Senate inquiry in 1912, claimed it was for crowd control. The crew needed to manage the rush to the lifeboats, ensuring an orderly evacuation. But survivor accounts tell a darker story. Daniel Buckley, a 21-year-old from County Cork, testified that a steward shouted at a group of third-class passengers, "Stay down there, you lot. The boats are for the quality." His words, recorded in the inquiry's transcripts, hint at a grim truth. The Titanic's rigid class system didn't end when disaster struck. Buckley survived by climbing a rope to the boat deck, his hands raw and bleeding, but he left behind friends who drowned behind locked gates. The inquiry confirmed that many third-class passengers faced barriers, gates, guarded stairwells, and crew orders that kept them below, while lifeboats, some half empty, were lowered above. The terror wasn't just the rising water. Survivors described hearing noises that didn't belong, groans from the ship's hull, like it was alive and in pain. Johan Svensson, a Swedish farmer traveling in third class, wrote to his family. Weeks later, the ship screamed, not just metal bending, but something deeper, like a beast trapped inside. I felt it watching us as we ran. Johan's letter, preserved in a Stockholm archive, wasn't alone. Other passengers reported similar sounds, low moans, creaks that seemed to whisper names, and thuds from deep within the ship. As the water reached their waists, some swore they saw things that defied explanation. Shadows moved in the flickering light, shapes that didn't match the living. A young woman named Anna, traveling with her infant son, shared a story that sent chills through the Carpathia's crew when she was rescued. Anna's account, recorded by a Carpathia nurse, described a figure in a white dress standing at the end of a flooded hallway. The woman's hair was wet, her face pale, and she beckoned Anna forward. "I thought she was a stewardess leading us to safety," Anna said. "I followed, holding my boy tight, but when I reached the spot, she was gone." Moments later, a crew member unlocked the gate near where the figure had stood, allowing Anna to escape to a lifeboat. No woman in a white dress was listed among the survivors, and Anna insisted the figure wasn't human. Her eyes were empty. She whispered, like she'd already drowned. Anna's story wasn't unique. Other third-class passengers reported seeing shadowy figures, men in crew uniforms who vanished. Women who appeared and disappeared in the chaos. Were they hallucinations, born of panic and cold, or something more sinister? The lock gates weren't confined to one area. Third-class passengers were spread across decks E, F, and G, and many faced similar barriers. Olaf Pedersen, a Norwegian laborer, described pounding on a gate until his fists bled, trying to reach his wife and daughter on the other side. His testimony, given to the British Inquiry, was heartbreaking. "I shouted their names, but the water was too loud. Then I heard something else, a laugh, low and cruel, behind the gate. It wasn't a sailor. It wasn't human." Olaf survived by swimming to a collapsible lifeboat, but his family perished. His story, like others, was dismissed as trauma, but it echoed accounts from across the ship. Fatima, a Lebanese mother, told rescuers she saw a shadow with no face standing behind a locked gate, watching as passengers begged. When she blinked, it was gone, but the gate remained locked until the water was chest high. The mystery deepened with reports from the crew. A stoker named Thomas, who survived by clinging to debris, told the Senate Inquiry he heard orders to keep the steerage down from a senior officer. He refused to name the officer, fearing reprisal, but his testimony fueled suspicions of deliberate neglect. The Titanic's lifeboats, designed to hold 1,178 people, carried only 706 survivors. Many boats were launched half full, with first-class passengers taking priority. Third-class passengers, who made up nearly half the ship's 2,100 souls, accounted for over 60% of the deaths. The math is stark. Of the 710 third-class passengers, only 174 survived. The lock gates, whether intentional or not, turned the lower decks into a death trap. But the horror wasn't just human failure. Survivors described an atmosphere in the lower decks that felt wrong, unnatural. The air grew heavy, not just with water, but with a presence. A Polish passenger, Marek, wrote in a letter to his brother, "The Carters felt alive, like the ship was angry with us. I saw shadows that moved without light, heard whispers in a language I didn't know." Marek's letter, found in a Krakow archive, wasn't unique. A group of Italian immigrants, huddled in a flooding cabin, prayed together as the water rose. One man, Giuseppe, swore he saw a figure in a black coat standing in the corner, untouched by the water. "He looked at us," Giuseppe told rescuers, "and smiled, but his face was wrong, like a mask." No such figure was ever identified. The Titanic's lower decks weren't just a place of physical danger. They seemed to hold something darker. The ship's construction in Belfast, Harlan, and Wolf Shipyard had its own eerie history. Workers reported accidents that couldn't be explained, tools vanishing, scaffolds collapsing, and whispers in the empty hull. One welder claimed he heard a voice say, "This ship will never reach shore," while working alone at night. Superstitious crew members whispered that the Titanic was cursed, built on the backs of exploited laborers and the arrogance of its owners, who boasted it was unsinkable. Some believe this curse manifested on April 14th as the gates locked and the shadows moved. The most haunting detail came from a survivor named Samuel, a 12-year-old boy traveling with his mother, rescued by the Carpathia. He told a nurse a story that left her trembling. As the water flooded their corridor, Samuel saw a man in a crew uniform standing by a locked gate. The man pointed to a stairwell, urging Samuel to run. "I followed him," Samuel said, "but when I looked back, he was gone. The gate was still locked, but the stairwell led me to a boat. No crew member matching his description was found, and Samuel's mother didn't survive. His story, recorded in the 1912 newspaper, added to the mystery. Was the man a guardian spirit, or something else, guiding the child to safety while others drowned? The locked gates of April 14, 1912, remain one of the Titanic's darkest mysteries. Why were third-class passengers left to drown? Was it deliberate, as survivors like Daniel Buckley claimed, or tragic oversight in the chaos? The U.S. and British inquiries offered no clear answers, and the White Star Line denied any policy of class-based neglect. But the numbers don't lie. The rich were saved, the poor were sacrificed. And one of the strange sightings, the woman in white, the faceless shadow, the laughing voice. Paranormal researchers suggest the Titanic's violent end left an imprint, a psychic scar that manifested in those desperate hours. Divers who explored the wreck in 1985 reported hearing odd noises, faint taps like hands on metal echoing from the rusted corridors. The Titanic's lower decks, now lying 12,500 feet below the Atlantic, hold secrets that may never be uncovered. The screams of those trapped behind the gates still linger in survivor accounts, passed down through generations. Some believe the ship's curse, born in the Belfast shipyards, took form that night, feeding on the fear and despair of the trapped. Others say the shadows and voices were hallucinations, the mind's desperate attempt to make sense of horror. But the stories persist, too many, dissimilar, to dismiss. Margaret Murphy, who survived, never spoke of the Titanic again after her letter. She lived quietly in Ireland, but her family said she woke screaming at night, hearing the clang of gates and the cries of those left behind. To this day, the locked gates of April 14, 1912, remain unclosed. The Titanic's wreck, split into on the ocean floor, guards its truths in silence. But the stories of that night of locked barriers, shadowy figures, and screams swallowed by the sea refuse to fade. They whisper of a tragedy not just of ice and steel, but of human choices and perhaps something beyond. What do you think? Were the gates locked by cruelty, chaos, or a curse that still haunts the deep? The answer lies in the cold, dark waters where the Titanic's ghosts may still be waiting. April 15, 1912. To 20 a.m. the RMS Titanic, the pride of the White Star Line, plunges into the icy depths of the North Atlantic. Its stern rises high, lights flickering like dying stars. Before it vanishes beneath the waves, over 1,500 souls are cast into water so cold it steals breath in seconds. But in those final, desperate moments, something eerie unfolds, a sound, a presence that lingers beyond the grave. This is the silent screams, a true story of courage, loss, and haunting mysteries tied to the Titanic's final hours. The screams of that night didn't stop when the ship sank. They echoed in the darkness, heard by survivors, rescuers, and even those far from the sea. Tonight, we uncover a chilling tale that will freeze your blood and leave you questioning what lingers in the deep where the Titanic rests. The Titanic's sinking was a tragedy of unimaginable scale. A ship deemed unsinkable, carrying 2,000 to 100 passengers and crew, met its end in just 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking an iceberg. As the bow dipped and the stern rose, panic swept the decks. Lifeboats, meant to save thousands, carried only 706 to safety, many half empty. First-class passengers were ushered to boats, while third-class fought through locked gates below. But in those final moments, as the ship broke into with a crack like thunder, one sound rose above the chaos. Screams, not just cries of fear, but wails of despair, loss, and something deeper, something that didn't fade when the ship disappeared. Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger who survived in Lifeboat 6, gave a chilling account during the U.S. Senate inquiry in 1912. She said, "The screams were unlike anything human. They came from everywhere, men, women, children, all swallowed by the sea. As we rowed away, the ship's lights went out, but the screams didn't stop. They followed us. Even when the water was still." Eloise's voice trembled as she described a detail that haunted her. The scream seemed to come from beneath the ocean, not just from those struggling on the surface. It was as if the sea itself was crying. She told senators, her eyes distant. Her testimony, published in newspapers, sent shivers through readers. How could screams persist in the freezing, silent depths? Eloise wasn't alone. Colonel Archibald Gracie, a historian and one of the last survivors pulled from the sea, wrote about those screams in his 1913 book, The truth about the Titanic. He was sucked underwater when the ship broke apart, clinging to a collapsible lifeboat in the minus-to-sea water. In his account, he wrote, "The screams followed me, even underwater. They weren't just voices, they were a chorus, a wail that felt alive. It was as if the dead were calling out, refusing to let go." Gracie's words carried weight. He was a meticulous man, not prone to exaggeration. Yet, he admitted those screams haunted him until his death months later, his health broken by hypothermia and trauma. He told friends he heard them in his dreams, a sound that never found peace. The Titanic's band, led by Wallace Hartley, played a heroic role in those final moments. As the ship tilted, the 8 musicians stood on the boat deck, their violins and cellos singing "Nearer, My God," to the survivors and lifeboats described the music as haunting, floating over the chaos like a prayer. Violet Jessup, a stewardess who survived, wrote in her memoir, "The band's music was a lifeline, but it couldn't drown out the screams. They grew louder as the ship sank, a sound that burned into my soul." The band played until the deck slanted steeply, their instruments slipping into the sea. None of the musicians survived, but their music and the screams lingered. In the memories of those who did, the most unsettling accounts came from the Carpathia, the ship that raced through the night to rescue Titanic survivors. James Walker, a Carpathia crew member, shared a story that chilled his shipmates. Hours after the last lifeboat was picked up, around 8 a.m. on April 15th, James was on deck, scanning the water for survivors. The sea was empty, littered with debris, chairs, life belts, and frozen bodies. But then he heard it, faint cries, like a distant crowd begging for help. He shone his lantern, sweeping it across the water, but saw nothing. It wasn't the wind. He later told his captain, his voice shaking, it was voices, hundreds of them, coming from nowhere. James' story, recorded in the 1912 ship's log, wasn't isolated. Other Carpathia crew reported similar sounds, wails that seemed to rise from the sea itself. Long after the living had been saved, survivors and lifeboats told similar tales. Charlotte Collier, a second-class passenger, wrote in a letter to her mother, "We rode away, but the screams followed us. They didn't stop when the ship went under. It was as if the water held them, trapped them. I covered my daughter's ears, but I couldn't block it out." Charlotte's letter, preserved in a London archive, described a detail that baffled her. The screams seemed to move, circling the lifeboats in the dark. Another survivor, Lawrence Beasley, a school teacher, noted in his book, The Loss of the Titanic, that the cries continued for nearly an hour after the ship sank, far longer than anyone could survive in the freezing water. It defied reason. He wrote, "The sound was alive, like the sea was speaking their pain." The screams weren't just heard that night. Days later, ships passing the wreck site reported strange sounds. The SS Californian, criticized for not aiding the Titanic, logged reports from crew who heard distant wails on April 16th while sailing through the debris field. A sailor named Thomas claimed he saw shapes in the water, pale faces, hands reaching up, then vanishing. His account, dismissed as guilt or exhaustion, was buried in the ship's records but later uncovered by historians. Even decades later, when the Titanic's wreck was found in 1985, divers reported eerie experiences. Robert Ballard, who led the expedition, noted in a 1986 interview that his team heard odd noises, faint taps, and wails while exploring the wreck at 12,500 feet. It felt like the ship was still grieving. He said, his voice uneasy. What caused these screams? Paranormal researchers believe the Titanic's violent end left a psychic imprint on the ocean. The extreme fear and suffering of 1,500 people, frozen in water so cold it burned, may have created an echo, a sound that lingers in the wreck site. Some call it a residual haunting, where moments of intense emotion replay like a broken record. Others point to the ship's history. Built in Belfast, Harland and Wolff Shipyard, the Titanic was plagued by strange incidents. Workers reported hearing voices in the empty hull, tools moving on their own, and a sense of being watched. One carpenter claimed he heard a scream during construction, like someone trapped inside the steel. "The ship is cursed," he told his foreman, quitting the next day. Could these early signs have been warnings of the horror to come? Survivors carried the screams with them long after. April 15th, Eva Hart, a 7-year-old third-class passenger, survived in a lifeboat with her mother. Years later, in a 1980s interview, she said, "I still hear them at night, the screams. They weren't just people drowning. It was something bigger, like the ship itself was crying out. Ava's mother, Esther, told a similar story, claiming she saw figures in the water, their mouths open in silent wails, even after the sea grew still. These accounts, shared in oral histories, suggest the Titanic's tragedy left more than physical wreckage. It left a wound in the world, a sound that refuses to fade. The Carpathia's crew faced their own mysteries. A nurse, Mary, who tended to survivors, wrote in her diary, "One woman, pulled from the water, kept screaming about a man in the sea. She said he was calling her name, but his face was gray, like he'd been dead for hours." The woman, a third-class passenger named Maria, insisted the man was her husband, who drowned when the ship sank. Yet she heard his voice hours later, clear as day, begging her to come back. Maria's story, recorded in a 1912 hospital report, was one of many. Other survivors described seeing loved ones in the water, their eyes empty, their voices calling out long after they should have been silent. The Titanic's bandleader, Wallace Hartley, became a symbol of courage, but his story has its own eerie twist. A violin, believed to be his, was found in 2006, locked in a case that survived the sinking. When it was opened, restorers claimed they heard faint music like a violin playing nearer. "My God, to thee," the sound stopped when they touched the instrument. Paranormal experts called it a residual echo, tied to Hartley's final act. Survivors who heard the band play swore the music lingered in their dreams, mixed with screams that never stopped. One survivor, a young boy named Frank, told rescuers he saw Hartley in the water, still holding his violin, his face calm as he sank. No such sighting was confirmed, but Frank's story added to the legend of the band's haunting presence. The silent screams weren't limited to the sea. In Southampton, families waiting for news of the Titanic reported strange occurrences in the days after April 15th. A widow named Clara, whose husband was a stoker, woke to screams outside her window on April 16th. She ran outside, but the street was empty. Another woman, Ellen, found her husband's coat left aboard the ship draped over a chair, still wet with seawater. These stories, collected in local newspapers, suggest the Titanic's tragedy reached beyond the ocean, touching those left behind. Some believe the screams were a psychic ripple, a cry from souls trapped in the moment of death. Others say the trauma was so immense, it imprinted itself on the world, echoing through time. The Titanic's wreck, discovered in 1985, holds more than rusted steel. Divers reported feeling watched, hearing taps and wails in the deep. One submersible pilot, in a 1990s documentary, said, "It's not just a wreck, it's alive, like it's still screaming." Paranormal investigators have visited the wreck site, using sonar to capture strange sounds, faint cries, like voices trapped in the hull. The Titanic lies into pieces, split by the force of its sinking, but its story feels unbroken. Its pain still raw. The screams of April 15, 1912, linger in survivor accounts, in the memories of rescuers, and in the cold, dark water where the ship rests. To this day, the silent screams of April 15, 1912, remain unclosed. Why did survivors hear voices long after the ship sank? Were they hallucinations, born of trauma and cold, or did the Titanic's victims leave a mark that defies death? The wreck, 12,500 feet below the Atlantic, guards its secrets in silence. But the stories of screams that followed lifeboats, of voices calling from the deep, of music that lingers in the dark refuse to rest. They whisper of a night when hope sank with the unsinkable ship, leaving behind a chorus of grief that still echoes. What do you think? Are the screams a trick of the mind? Or do the Titanic's ghosts still cry out in the deep? The answer lies in the icy waves, where the past refuses to stay silent.